In this very in-depth forecast, western Texas and New Mexico are currently being monitored for severe weather as a couple of discrete supercells could harbor the potential of 1 or 2 brief tornadoes, scattered large hail upwards of 2 inches, and isolated damaging wind gusts upwards of 50 miles per hour. Everything you need to know on Project Gladiator. Hello everyone, welcome back to another Project Gladiator weather forecast. Today I'll be covering the weather for May 11th, 2024. For today we have a slight risk for western Texas with a marginal risk that extends up across New Mexico. This is going to be the primary thing that we're going to be covering in today's forecast. We also have a marginal risk for northern Minnesota and northeastern North Dakota there, as well as a marginal risk for western Pennsylvania into eastern Ohio and West Virginia. These two marginal risks I will likely not cover in today's forecast, but for our risks for today, we do have a 2% tornado risk for the marginal and slight risk regions for western Texas and New Mexico, as well as a 5% wind risk for all marginal and slight risk locations, all locations that are expected to see the risk for severe thunderstorms, as well as a 15% hail risk for that slight risk region. That's going to be the primary driving risk for that slight risk region there, as well as a 5% hail risk for the marginal risk for the eastern seaboard, without really all that much of a hail risk for the marginal risk for the northern central plains there. For tomorrow, we do have a slight risk for the Mississippi River Valley, for Louisiana into eastern Texas, with a marginal threat that extends up across western Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Panhandle, western Kansas, with a marginal risk that also includes Wisconsin and Michigan. Risks for tomorrow do include a 2% tornado risk for Louisiana and eastern into central Texas, 15% damaging wind risk for the slight risk regions, as well as a marginal risk region, as well as a 15% hail risk for the slight risk region, with a 5% hail risk for the marginal risk region up to the north. So the wind risk and the hail risk are going to be the primary driving risk for that slight risk region, with an additional tornado risk for tomorrow. For our day 3 outlook, we do have a pretty broad slight risk for eastern Texas into southern Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Risks for tomorrow do include for our day 3 outlook do include a probabilistic 15%, with the possibility of some significant severe thunderstorms for eastern Texas into southern Arkansas and Louisiana. For day 4, day 8 outlook, we currently don't have anything issued for our day 4, day 8 outlooks. Taking a look at our WPC outlook, starting off with our excessive rainfall forecast. For today, we do have a pretty large marginal risk that extends all the way from central into western Texas, eastern New Mexico into southeastern Colorado, where we could see the risk for some isolated flash flooding. For our day 2 outlook, we actually have a moderate risk for eastern Texas, where we are expected to see the possibility of some widespread flash flooding, including the possibility of some significant flash flooding for eastern Texas in the moderate risk region. So if you do live in the affected region, definitely make sure you are watching for any updates regarding that risk for flash flooding for tomorrow. For our day 3 outlook, we do have a slight risk that extends from the Florida Panhandle, Georgia, southern Alabama, southern Mississippi, Louisiana, and eastern Texas, where we could see the potential for some scattered flash flooding. Taking a look at our weather model, starting off with our 500 millibars like we usually do, as well as our surface observations and how our upper air pattern and our surface observations are going to work in conjunction to support our risk for severe thunderstorms for today. Starting off with our upper air pattern, as of right now, we do have a pretty powerful trough that is moving and advecting into this region. It is positively tilted though, so we don't really have a whole lot of forcing that's being pushed into this region, but we definitely do have some pretty noticeable spreading of our wind vectors up into the New Mexico region, which will definitely be a massive supporter in our risk for severe thunderstorms, and will definitely supply a lot of lift to this region and be very encouraging to our risk for severe thunderstorms across this region. But further down to the south, we do have a pretty powerful subtropical jet advecting out of the Pacific Ocean here, and that is also expected to work in conjunction with this trough and support the risk for severe thunderstorms across western Texas and New Mexico. We do have some pretty powerful 500 millibar flow that is expected to move across this region. We shouldn't necessarily see a noticeable embedded shortwave or a noticeable embedded jet streak that is expected to move into this region. Our flow should stay pretty steady. It may increase as the sun sets and we have more of a temperature gradient, but overall we shouldn't really see anything too crazy happen with our trough and our subtropical jet. But again, both of them will work in conjunction to support the risk for severe thunderstorms. We will have some pretty powerful flow at our 500 millibars though, with a 500 millibar flow upwards of 50 to 40 miles per hour across this region, which will be a major support in our risk for severe thunderstorms and encourage a lot of lift across this region. We do have a surface low that is currently located across northwestern New Mexico, with a warm front or a differential heating boundary that is draped down across this region, and that is expected to fire our storms across this region. Our storms are expected to fire along either that warm front or our differential heating boundary. Our differential heating boundary is likely being picked up on our surface observations as a warm front, but that's what our storms will fire off of amongst our pretty decent lift across this region. Taking a look at our 850 millibars and how that's going to indicate our directional shear across this region with our low-level jet, we are expected to see a very weak low-level jet across this region that will be very supportive of some very weak directional shear across this region, and will support overall a very low-end tornado risk across this region. Definitely shouldn't see anything too crazy as far as a tornado risk due to the fact that we don't have a really powerful low-level jet to really support a whole lot of directional shear, but we may be able to see a little bit of curvature in the low levels of our hodograph that may be able to support a little bit of spin and maybe a low-end risk for tornadoes across this region. But overall, we shouldn't really see anything too crazy as far as our risk for tornadoes. Taking a look at our 200 millibars and how that will affect our overall risk for severe thunderstorms as well as our speed shear for our hail risk across this region, we are expected to see a pretty powerful 200 millibar jet that is expected to move into this region with 200 millibar flow that's going to be really broad, with a really broad exit region that extends all the way from southern Colorado into the Gulf of Mexico here, with some pretty powerful 200 millibar flow upwards of 100 knots and potentially even the upper 90 knots across this region. And as the sun sets and we see a little bit more of a temperature gradient and potentially slightly stronger flow, we definitely see that increase at least a little bit. And that will be very supportive of a hail risk across this region. So we do have some pretty decently strong 500 millibar flow, and we will definitely see quite a lot of speed shear that will be supportive of a hail risk across this region. Taking a look at our bulk shear and how that will indicate our hail risk across this region, we do have some really decent bulk shear values across this region that are going to be very supportive of a hail risk across this region with any storms that can develop, with quite a lot of bulk shear values in the 15% hail risk, getting upwards of the upper 70s and the mid to low 80s across this region, which will be very supportive, very indicative of the potential for some scattered large hail with any storms that can develop. However, I am thinking that this risk may decrease in the next SPC update. We may not have a 15% hail risk in the next SPC update, and it's mainly coming down to our coverage for our storms. The last couple of ARRR model runs have indicated overall more of a downtrend of overall storm coverage, which will likely lead to more of an isolated risk for large hail across this region, but regardless, depending on our coverage of our storms, we will definitely have a large atmospheric support for the potential for large hail with any storms that can develop, as regardless of storm coverage, any storms that can develop across this region will definitely have the availability to support some really large hail. And further off to the north, we don't have as high bulk shear values, but we definitely have some pretty high bulk shear values, upwards of 60 to 70 across this region, which will definitely be a really big support for some hail and potentially even some larger hailstones across this region. I definitely think potentially upwards of 2 inches is possible, but it likely won't get above that. Taking a look at our storm relative helicity and how that will indicate our hail risk across this region, we are expected to see some lower end storm relative helicity values across this region as a result of a much weaker low level jet. When we do see a higher temperature gradient and potentially stronger flow aloft, we may get some higher storm relative helicity values across this region for a short period of time. However, we can't make decisions on that just yet because we haven't looked at our instability just yet to really show how those will overlap. So even if we may have some stronger storm relative helicity values than previously anticipated, we will have to wait to look at our instability. But we will definitely have our storm relative helicity values in place that will be supportive of at least the potential for some isolated tornado or two being possible with any storms that could develop across this region. Same with further down to the south, where we definitely will have some pretty decent storm relative helicity values that are definitely going to be supportive of at least the potential for an isolated tornado or two in the 2% tornado risk. Taking a look at our composite reflectivity so we can go over some general radar analysis. Again, I still don't really feel too comfortable with timing, so I'm not really going to try and dabble too much in timing until I can feel more confident with it. But with our radar analysis, as I was previously mentioning, we have a significant downtrend in the overall coverage of our storms compared to what models were indicating earlier this morning or yesterday, where we do have only a couple of storms that want to fire with more messy convection that is more so towards the north of that marginal threat region. We were expected to see some widespread discrete storms across this region that could harbor the potential for a weak brief tornado, an isolated tornado, or the potential for some scattered large hail or isolated large hail, or the potential for some isolated damaging wind gusts. However, our overall storm coverage has definitely been on more of a downtrend, and we may not even get storms to really fire at all in the slight risk region anymore, as we do have like two discrete storms that want to fire in the slight risk region, which is just not enough to really harbor a slight risk region as far as coverage. So I would not be surprised if this slight risk was removed in the next SPC update. Taking a look at our dew points and how that will affect our instability across this region, we do have some much lower end dew points despite it being mid-May. That is because the majority of our moisture was cleared out by a cold front that did pass through that led to some severe thunderstorms a couple days ago. So we don't have as much moisture anymore, and it is working on recovering. So with lower dew point values that are going to be primarily in the mid to low 60s, potentially in the more lower 60s, may not really reach the mid 60s, and more widespread dew points that are going to be in the upper to mid 50s across this region, and even in the low 50s and upper 40s the further north you go into regions such as New Mexico. This lack of moisture will definitely lead to some much more limited instability. Taking a look at our temperatures and how that will affect our instability, as well as taking a look at our differential heating boundary, you can see that differential heating boundary pretty clear here. The main reason I think that we may have less coverage of storms further down to the south is that we don't really have a whole lot of forcing with differential heating boundaries. Of course, they do act like a pseudo-stationary front, a pseudo-warm front, and we'll definitely be able to fire off our storms. However, we have less of a temperature gradient and less of a differential heating boundary further down to the south, with temperatures that range anywhere from the low 80s to the upper 70s further down to the south and the slight risk. So that will likely lead to less of a temperature gradient along our differential heating boundary, and less of a trigger, and likely overall less storms that are going to fire across this region, less likely for storms to fire. But further off to the north, we will definitely have a really clear differential heating boundary and a lot more support along that differential heating boundary, which is expected to be a little bit more guaranteed to fire off our storms. But further off to the east of our differential heating boundary, because differential heating boundary is kind of a pseudo quote-unquote warm front, we will have lower end temperatures to the east of our differential heating boundary, with temperatures that are expected to get upwards of the mid to potentially the upper 70s across this region by the time our storms fire, and that will definitely allow for some pretty decent instability for our storms to work with. However, our storms are expected to fire pretty late in the evening, so by the time our storms do fire, the sun will slowly begin to set, and by the time the sun does set and we lose surface heating and our storms become elevated, our storms will likely be dying out pretty quickly as they exit towards the later half of the marginal risk area, and our storms begin to die out. So our storms will have a good 3 hours or so to really support potentially a tornado or two, but as storms slowly begin to die out and become more outflow dominant, we will see our storms still support the potential of some isolated damaging wind gusts and maybe some hail, but we will likely not really see too much of a tornado risk after sunset. Same goes for further down to the south as well. Taking a look at our lapse rates and how that's expected to affect our instability and our hail risk across this region, we are expected to see some pretty decent lapse rates across this region, kind of feeding in from the west in the more desertous region. And with this being a little bit more of a desertous region, because this is western Texas and New Mexico, we will have some higher end lapse rates across this region, with lapse rates that are expected to get upwards of the 7s and the upper 6s across this region, and that will extend down across the marginal risk into the slight risk region. That will definitely aid in our instability overall, and also aid in our hail risk, as we will see a expanded layer for hail development aloft, and that will likely be a major aid in our hail risk as well as our overall instability and overall our risk for severe thunderstorms, as their lapse rates just tend to be a overall aid with tons of different things regarding our storms. Taking a look at our cloud cover and how that is expected to affect our instability across this region, from the beginning, we did have some pretty hefty cloud cover across this region, which definitely led to overall less instability. However, that did keep any overmixing at bay compared to if we had perfectly sunny skies across this region. And right now we do have a little bit of cloud cover across this region, but our storms are also developing, so we are bound to see a little bit more heftier cloud cover, but with the fact that we did have some cloud cover previously, that definitely did prevent any overmixing, and now that we have a little bit of a clearing, that will definitely allow for our instability to build across this region and fuel our severe thunderstorms. So overall, we are doing pretty good as far as cloud cover, and we will definitely see quite a lot of decent instability come out of the fact that the clearing has now cleared. Taking a look at our 700 millibar temperatures and our convective inhibition and how that is expected to affect our overall risk for severe thunderstorms as well as our instability. As of right now, our cap has broken for the most part, as we do have some development already ongoing, indicated by these severe thunderstorm warnings. But we do have some constant warmer advection out of the south, southwest, southeast, mainly just out of the south, which is likely leading to a little bit more of an elevated mixed layer across this region and more convective inhibition. However, with the fact that the elevated mixed layer has mostly broken for the most part at least, that likely did lead to overall more explosive development and likely more instability across this region, as it will allow for instability to build, at least up until the point that the elevated mixed layer breaks. Further down to the south, we likely do have more hefty convective inhibition, as we will have a stronger warm air advection and a overall less apparent differential heating boundary. So that is leading to more convective inhibition across this region, and that will definitely be much harder for our differential heating boundary to overcome, especially with the fact that it is weaker further down to the south. Our differential heating boundary is significantly weaker, and has overall less forcing along that differential heating boundary, with stronger warm air advection aloft and a stronger elevated mixed layer. Again, that is definitely going to be much more limiting to our risk for severe thunderstorms further down to the south. And by the time the sun sets, we will see our convective inhibition be introduced again extremely rapidly, choking off any storms that are currently ongoing, and likely preventing any further development that hasn't developed already. So this is the main reason why I do think that the slight risk will likely be removed in the next SPC outlook, is due to the fact that our convective inhibition is going to be a significantly more limiting factor, with the fact that we have a less apparent, less forceful differential heating boundary across this region, will likely lead to a much lower end risk for severe thunderstorms overall. Taking a look at our most unstable cape and how that is expected to fuel our overall risk for severe thunderstorms for today, we are expected to see some pretty decent instability across this region, with cape values that aren't expected to be absolutely necessarily too crazy compared to previously this week and last week, but we should definitely see some pretty decent cape values across this region, getting upwards of the mid 1000s to potentially the 2000s in some regions. Further down to the south, we will likely see cape values that could potentially reach the widespread upper 1000s and maybe the widespread low 2000s across this region, which will definitely be able to fuel our risk for severe thunderstorms. We will definitely have sufficient instability to fuel our risk for severe thunderstorms, including our various risks, such as the possibility of 1 or 2 brief tornadoes across this region, the possibility of some scattered large hail and isolated large hail further off to the north, as well as the potential for some isolated damaging wind gusts. We will definitely have some pretty sufficient instability. Taking a look at our surface-based cape and how that is expected to indicate the risk for surface-based storms, the potential for tornadoes across this region. For the first couple of hours, for around the first 2 to 3 hours after storms develop, they are expected to be surface-based, as we will definitely see the majority of our most unstable cape translate down to our surface and allow for surface-based storms and the potential for tornadoes. However, that will definitely be a very thin sliver surface-based instability, as storms quickly race off to the east and leave that sliver of surface-based instability. They will become elevated and will not be able to support the potential for tornadoes, and that will also come with the fact that the sun is expected to set around 9 to 10 p.m. across this region. That will likely elevate any surface-based storms that are currently ongoing by the time the sun does set across this region, and we lose that surface heating. And further down to the south, we will definitely have some pretty decent surface-based instability that doesn't really look like it will lead to any elevated storms, and any storms that can develop further down to the south will likely be elevated, but it depends on if storms can even fire further down to the south to begin with. Taking a look at our 0 to 3 kilometer instability and how that is expected to aid in our overall risk for severe thunderstorms, we are expected to see some pretty decent 0 to 3 kilometer instability values across this region. That is expected to be mainly in the double digits, maybe reaching the triple digits in some regions. It's definitely going to be a little bit more on the weaker side of things, but we'll definitely be able to aid in our overall risk for severe thunderstorms, but will likely be a more smaller aid, more of a smaller push than really anything too substantial. Taking a look at our energy helicity index values and how that will indicate our tornado risk across this region, we are expected to see some pretty spotty lower energy helicity index values. They're definitely going to be pretty in line with the potential for 1 or 2 brief tornadoes across the 2% tornado risk region, plus with the uncertainty further down to the south, even though we will have a little bit higher energy helicity index values and overall potentially a higher pool of ingredients for the potential for tornadoes. We do have lower confidence for storms overall in the 2% tornado risk further down to the south. If we did have higher confidence for our storms, then I think that this could definitely go up to a 5% tornado risk. But with the fact that we don't have as much confidence with our storms actually even firing across the slight risk region, we definitely don't have too high of a tornado risk, but we could definitely see the possibility for 1 or 2 brief tornadoes across this region. Taking a look at our wind gusts and how that will indicate the potential for damaging wind gusts across this region. Again, we do have the possibility for some isolated damaging wind gusts that aren't necessarily expected to be too strong, and that's definitely a possibility with a lot of these storms. That are indicating the potential for some isolated damaging wind gusts potentially reaching upwards of 50 to potentially 40 miles per hour across this region. But with our storms being more isolated, we will definitely see overall a net lower risk for damaging wind gusts overall. But we could definitely see the possibility of some isolated damaging wind gusts with any storms that can develop. taking a look at our mesoanalysis page for the potential for hail across this region, we do have a pretty large 32 on our large hail parameter for western Texas there in that slight risk region, with what seems to be potentially I think a 10 and a 12 that extends up across the rest of the marginal risk, and it even goes up to 20 and 16 in New Mexico there. Definitely going to be very supportive of the potential for large hail across this region. However, further down to the south, we do have overall higher bulk shear values, but overall less of a certainty for storms to develop across this region. So even if we do have the kinematics to be overall higher to support the potential for a large hail, I don't really have too much confidence of storms actually developing and firing across this region. So again, I wouldn't be surprised if they were to remove that slight risk region in the next SPC outlook. Now that I've told you the weather, please go down to the description and check out the socials for Project Gladiator and join the Discord for any updates on Project Gladiator. If you live in any of the areas I covered for today, please stay weather alert for the time being. If you notice anything might have been wrong in this forecast, or would like to make a suggestion or ask a question, please leave a comment. 3 other channels I highly suggest you check out are One Nation Weather, Weather Watcher, and JaxonWX. The links to those channels will be in the description, and hopefully I'll be able to see you guys tomorrow with another forecast.